I
Great.
found this on the web.
All right. Okay. So everything's cool. So we're recording. I'll start talking, and then in just a minute, if we can share the screen.
Command 3.
What am I listening to? Some voice. Okay. Okay.
God.
It's
You
the
will
voice.
you will be
Sorry,
sharing the screen because you're
Shoma, are you recording?
I am
Everybody
recording.
should mute. Yeah.
We will mute, but Alan, you share your screen because I don't have anything to share for you. It's your co-host, so you can share your screen.
Got it.
Okay, I'm gonna mute now.
And make sure this is going to work, though. Why is this not working? Come on. Desktop 2. Desktop 2. Okay, here we go. One moment. I have to share my screen. Okay. All right. I have to quit and come right back on. Oh, God. Let's see. You can choose to quit soon now. Let's see if this works. Okay. We never had this happen before. I guess there are some changes. All right. Okay. All right. Let's try this again. Share screen. Okay.
Got it.
All right. So you should see a whole screen and
Yeah, got it.
okay. How's that?
Wonderful.
All right. So Barbara, you had said that I would be talking about my exhibit design stuff in my photography. So I'm just going to talk about the exhibit design because the photography is a whole other thing. This is very weird because I'm on two computers, so one screen and another computer, and all I see is a blank screen. So I'm talking, instead of talking to you, who I'd like to see, I'm getting this blank screen. All right. Anyway, so I'm calling this Under the Elephants because I got my start in doing exhibit design work, working for the Field Museum, where they have these two giant elephants. That's had been the kind of trademark for the Field Museum for a long time. I had gotten hired by the museum because they were looking for a photographer with anthropology background. And some of you know, I had been in a PhD program in philosophy and anthropology, and then also taking a lot of courses in photography as well. So I was kind of a perfect person for this job, and got it, and it was great. And you will see, there I am, quite a number of years ago when my hair was still black. And I was working on the Eskimo and Northwest Coast exhibit. And this is an example. If you haven't seen that exhibit, it is still up. I did this over 30 years ago, and it is still up, although the museum has hidden it. So it's virtually impossible to find. So the last time I went to the Field Museum, I spent 20 minutes trying to find it because they had reconfigured the entrance. So now you enter at the end of the exhibit. So it kind of destroyed the entire idea of working on an exhibit. But what it did do, working for the Field Museum, was just give me a sense that this was pretty interesting work. I never even knew that field existed, designing and planning, developing exhibits. I don't know. I didn't know where they came from, but it never occurred to me as a career. So I kind of stumbled into it. And then I really stumbled into it when it was the Field Museum, while a wonderful place, and it has changed. But when I was there, it was an incredibly toxic work environment. Little cliques of people. I used to say that it made academic politics look like child play. It was, limited resources and everyone was fighting for their own territory. It was not a healthy place to work. So I had a friend who was a historian, and he'd been hired by the Commonwealth Edison Company because it was their centennial coming up, and they wanted him to write a corporate history, which he did, and they liked it. I guess it hadn't been published yet, but they had reviewed it. So then they asked him whether he would like to do an exhibit they said, can you do an exhibit for us on our centennial? And he said, sure, not having any idea how to do that whatsoever. So he called me up, and I had already left the Field Museum and was trying to figure out what the next step was. And he said, can you do that? And I said, sure. And then I called my friend Cliff, who was the lead designer at the Field Museum. I said, you've been fetching about this for years. Why don't you quit? We'll form a business and we'll start, working on this. So he quit and we started work on the Commonwealth Edison Centennial. And it was a project on the social impact of the electrification of the Midwest. This seems impossible to believe that an American corporation would agree to this, but they did. We had meetings in the green room, meeting with the CEO and with all sorts of people from Commonwealth Edison. I actually convinced them that this is when atomic energy was a big deal. This was I guess it was also about 30 years ago. And I said, look, and I did a lot of research and I realized that the more research you do about anything, the more you realize how complicated it is and how there are no simple answers. And so what I learned was that you can't store electricity efficiently. So any utility has to make exactly the amount of energy that they believe is going to be needed. They make too much, they're wasting money. They make too little, and you have brownouts and blackouts. So I developed a thing called the load dispatcher game. We had all sorts of stuff. And so I actually had set up this thing where there'd be a debate about atomic energy, its pluses and its minuses. And the CEO agreed to this. I was stunned, but they did. And we went a year developing this exhibit. We actually got to the construction phase, full of blueprints, construction-ready drawings, at which point they pulled the plug, as it were, because they decided that they wanted to do a rate increase, and they were afraid that people would be upset that they were spending money on this. Now, the truth is that the entire cost of this was less than one TV commercial that they were running. They rented for us right across from the Cultural Center on Randolph Street on Michigan Avenue. They rented that whole ground floor of that building, and that was going to be our exhibit. And I had offices upstairs. It was going to be great. But and I turned to Clifford and I said, well, I guess we're in business now. And so we started looking for other work and trying to figure out what to do. And then we got wind that the State History Museum of Wisconsin was revamping the entire museum, and they were looking for a firm in order to tell the story from first contact with Europeans to the present day. It was 2 floors. It was about 25,000 square feet of exhibits, I think. It was a major project. And so we started to put a proposal together, and we indicated to them our interest in doing this. And then we realized this was really big. And so we contacted a colleague and we said, why don't we go in together on this? And so he said, great. And then I called up the director of the museum and I said, so listen, what would you think if we teamed up with Frank Madsen? And he started laughing. And I said, what? And he said, well, I guess we had already put in a proposal. And he said, we couldn't decide between the two of you. So we joined forces. And then he said, so what's the name of your business? And Clifford and I had never incorporated or done anything. We were just pretty casual about it. And he said, well, for the state, you need to have a business. What's the name of the business? And the three of us were kind of standing there and we just went, Abrams, Teller, Madsen. And that was the name for 25 years. So, so this was the first major project that I worked on. And what you're seeing is a cow, as you can tell. But what it's on is most unusual. It is on a bed of machine parts. Because in my research, I realized that while it's known as the dairy state, actually Wisconsin's really its industry is its base. Wisconsin makes the machines that makes tools, that makes the machines. They don't build cars, but they make the machines that builds the cars. And so this started my whole kind of exhibit idea of using metaphors and trying to create situations that are visually interesting and intriguing. I want to come up and get a closer look. Here originally, I had not wanted the machine parts to be painted yellow, painted gold. I just wanted it to be rusty machine parts. But this began my understanding of the battles that you have to take, which you sometimes win and sometimes lose. I lost this one, but it doesn't really matter because it was intriguing enough that people came up to see it. So that's a really good example of what we were doing. Wisconsin was known as the immigrant state. It had more immigrants than any other state, largely because in the 1800s, Wisconsin established an immigration office in Germany in order to attract people to come to Wisconsin. And they did in droves. And so it had a huge German population. So we set this up with a lot of, I used photography as much as possible and working with artifacts as well. We recreated a Wisconsin bar that you could kind of, sit at. It was really pretty interesting. Back up for a second. But I had two really interesting experiences with in Wisconsin in doing the exhibit. One was that I always wanted to start. Well, I started the pattern with this project. I always wanted to find out the people who worked there. Why were they working there? What did it mean to them? Everything from the janitor to the secretaries to the curators to the director. I wanted people to be involved and invested in the project. So I would ask people, so why did you become a museum curator? Why did you start working for the museum? Until I spoke to this one guy who was their curator of military items. And he started looking around kind of furtively. He said, you really want to know? I said, yes, I really want to know. And then he said, I love the bayonets. And sometimes at night when nobody's around, I take the bayonets and I scream. And I said, oh, that's very interesting. Look at the time. I got to go. And so I kind of moderated how I asked that question in the future. All right. So then the next major project was the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library. This is really a great project. And again, I found that that the more research that I do, the more interesting things become, and the more modified my positions on anything might have been. So, I'm an ex-campus radical. I was in the group of people trying to levitate the Pentagon in the days of rage, against the war in Vietnam. Here I am telling the Herbert Hoover story. This, I thought, arch conservative. And, I'm holding his story in my hands. And I thought that this was kind of an interesting turnaround. So an example is of the kind of things that I like to do in exhibits is the quote game. So I read Herbert Hoover's 1924 book called American Individualism. And I was struck in reading that book that this did not sound like a Republican of those days, and certainly not a Republican of these days. He had quotes in there like, the only thing wrong with capitalism is capitalists. They're too damn greedy. He had a whole philosophy of building things from the bottom up, but of government helping. Not, this was not the Reagan, the problem, is government. No, not at all. But he had a belief in people, which was really very interesting. So in reading this, I had all these different ideas of who might have said these things. So I set this up so that there's a crawl sign that would go all of the quotes that came from this book. And then you had to decide, was it Jefferson? Was it Karl Marx? Was it Herbert Hoover? Was it FDR? Was it Helen Keller? Was it JFK? And more often than not, it turned out to be Herbert Hoover. So it was eye-opening for visitors. It was pretty great. And similarly, if you look at Hoover and his beliefs, and what he did do and what he didn't do, you cannot understand it if you look at him face on. You have to look at it through the lens of his belief in the individual, and you have to look at it through the lens of his belief in our responsibility to our neighbor. So what I did was I borrowed the design from Agam, who was an Israeli artist, and I made these waffles, and I had two portraits of Hoover, and we colored one of them, hand-colored one of them, and then cut it in strips and did it like this. So if you look at it straight on, you get a confused image. If you go to one side and read the label explaining his beliefs, you get a coherent picture. If you move to the other side, you get a coherent picture. If anybody wants to unmute themselves at some point and jump in or say something or make a noise, that's fine with me. So, all right. And then the other thing we did, which I tried to do in most of my exhibits, is to set up these, as I said, these kind of visual metaphors. So it turns out that Hoover, who was reviled because of what he did or didn't do during the Depression, was known as, he became the Secretary of Commerce under Calvin Coolidge. And he started the FAA, he started the FCC, he standardized brick sizes, tire threads, milk bottle sizes. He was an engineer. He was the first in the first engineering class at Stanford. Actually, Leland Stanford himself recruited him to do this, and he was an orphan, from Iowa. He standardized road signs. I mean, he put an engineer's head to the problems, including this. So during World War I, Belgium was blockaded, and the people were starving. And you had the two, forces. No one was letting anything in, and the Belgian people were starving to death. Hoover is credited conservatively with saving over 1 million lives because he stopped the war. He actually stopped the war. He brought food aid in and was able to save the day. So what I did was I found these really disturbing photographs of starving children, from the blockade of Belgium, and I set them up on kind of fake tombstones. So when you're walking into the gallery, that hits you first, because I felt that you needed to understand the need before you could understand the solution. And the solution was he sent tons upon tons upon tons of food, specifically flour. The Belgians were so grateful for this that they took the empty flour sacks and they embroidered them and they sent them to Hoover. So in the Hoover Presidential Library in West Branch, Iowa, there's a whole room of the presents that, unlike Trump, who decided to keep all the presents, they don't belong to you. They belong to the people. So this is in this permanent exhibit. But we recreated a food relief warehouse based on photographs. And so I have two really interesting stories from this experience. Can everybody hear me? Can somebody do something so I can hear that you're hearing me?
Yeah, I can hear you. I have a question for you, Alan.
Yes.
Why Herbert Hoover at this Wisconsin museum?
No, it's a new exhibit. This is the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library. I'm sorry. I didn't make that clear. No. I have all these different projects and I'm just jumping from one to the other.
Thank you.
So, yeah. All right, good. So you guys can hear me. All right. Well, I have two things that happened here. One was, I may have told this story at some point, but I will tell it again. So we had a meeting and the director of the museum was Richard Norton Smith. And we had this long table and he would be at one end of the table and I'd be at the other end of the table. And his staff would be on one side and my staff would be on the other side. And so Richard says, this is just great. What you guys have done is amazing. This is a fantastic exhibit. This is beyond what I expected. So what I'd really like to do for the opening is to have my good friend Richard Nixon open the exhibit. At which point I lost my presence of mind. And it's a true story. I jumped up and I said, Richard Nixon, the greatest crook that American politics is. And I go on and on and on. And then suddenly I look around and I see that everybody's kind of slipping onto the table. And I actually said, oops. And Richard gets up and he says, Richard Nixon is the greatest man who has ever walked the face of the earth. Because what did Christ know about foreign policy? And then he gets up and he walks out and he slams the door. And I turned to his staff and I said, is he serious? And they said, we never know. So the next day, got together and I said, listen, Richard, you've converted me, a definite leftist into understanding the importance of Herbert Hoover and what a significant figure he was. I said, why would you want to have somebody who's a divisive figure? that doesn't make any sense, because then you're only going to be speaking to the people who already, believe in this, and you're not going to attract any new people. And he begrudgingly said, well, okay. He said, yeah, you're right. That's true. Okay. How about instead I have my good friend Ronald Reagan open the exhibit? And there was nothing I could do or say. So Ronald Reagan did open the exhibit, and he got a tour, private tour before the big gala. Got a private tour, and he was very, very, very moved by what he saw in the warehouse. And I should mention that I also had realized that it wasn't just Belgium. He had helped other places as well. Hoover actually was the starter of CARE, which I think still exists, but I'm not sure. It was one of the major food aid programs, international food aid programs. And so I decided to issue a press release, to see if there were people in the Midwest who either themselves were saved or, whose parents were saved. And I was mentioning this to my mother-in-law, who was from Czechoslovakia, and she kind of got misty, and she said, I remember the peanuts butter. And apparently they got aid as well. They kept the tins that food came in and often filed it down to make it into drinking cups. So I ended up getting about 30 different people from the Midwest whose lives had been saved by Herbert Hoover. And so we did a film. And I interspersed the interviews with these people with, historic footage. So when Reagan is seeing this, he just turns to the director, to Richard, and he said, wow, this is amazing. Do I have anything like this in my museum? I'm sorry, you're muted, because I probably could hear the laughs. All right. And again, some of you may have seen this or not, but let's see. Are you seeing the bar on top that says mute and stop video and all that? Or are you just seeing the picture of the rabbi?
I can't read whatever's on top.
Yeah,
Oh,
either can I. It's too dark.
But it's a great picture.
But the rabbi, and it looks like the rabbi has cracks in him.
Yes, yeah. All right, so you see that. Well, that's what matters. So I did the Holocaust Memorial for the Spertus Museum, which is no longer there, unfortunately. I mean, there is the Spertus Institute, but the museum is very different. And so this was a very small but very powerful exhibit on the Holocaust. And what I did here was, this is a photograph by Roman Vishniak, a very famous photographer, and it's of a Polish Jew. And I blew it up to about 8 feet square. And then I put a piece of plate glass in front of it. And then I begged his forgiveness, and I smashed it with a hammer. And then I put a charred remains of a Torah scroll on the bottom, and a tallis, and some other books, and prayer books. And this was about Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass. You don't have to read to know that some damage was done. If you read, there's a reading rail on the bottom with a lot more information. But you can get the point without having to read. So I've always been interested. I felt for a very long time that exhibit design is the communication of ideas in space. And it's actually the choreographing of ideas in space, because you are moving people through an environment. And as you're doing so, you're showing them something, you're teaching them something, you're trying to get some ideas across. I found this was great. So the other thing I did was this. Based on the work that I did on the Northwest Coast for the Field Museum, the Tlingit tribe has a tradition making what's called a transformation mask, where they have a mask, it might be of a raven, let's say, and then the mask will open up to reveal something else inside. And so what I did here was I took a portrait of Hjalmar Schacht, who was the Nazi finance minister, and I set it up as a transformation mask, where it opens up, and inside you see dead bodies. And I'm always amazed when the museum lets me do stuff like this, because it's pretty strong stuff, but they did. And what was really wonderful about this was, so here's the facade of the businessman, but it's really hiding the reality. And those are the kind of exhibits that for me are personally meaningful. There was a guest book that people, wrote in, and it was just great. I mean, people were deeply, deeply moved by this. We also did a tombstone. I set up a room where, the walls were painted black, and in dark gray, I had the names of all of the communities that were destroyed, the little shtetls that were any place that had a name that was destroyed by the Nazis. And then put in video screens where the names of relatives of local residents would scroll, one to the other. And every year they would open this up so that if more people had done some genealogical research or heard more stories or whatever, they could come and add their names, to this. It was really powerful. And I don't know if you can read this, but it's by Nellie Sachs, who's a poet, I believe, who won the Nobel Prize. And she says, when someone lifts us, he lifts in his hand millions of memories, which do not dissolve in blood like evening, for we are memorial stones embracing all dying. And I surrounded this with small stones. In Jewish tradition, when you go to a cemetery, to place a stone on top of the tombstone. So I'm fond of saying that this is an interactive. However, it's done with stones. It's not done electronically. And that exhibit, once they closed the museum and sold the building to Columbia College, and then built the new museum and the blank, the empty lot adjoining, they never recreated that, which was really unfortunate because it was very powerful. I did a bunch of exhibits for Spertus, including one called What is Judaism? And so I came up with the idea of taking the Shema, the central prayer for Jewish belief, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai God, which is roughly translated as Hear, O God, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. So I came up with the idea of making blocks and putting different translations of each of the words of the Shema on a different face. And so what I was doing was really explaining interpretation, that you can take that prayer and you can lay this out in many different ways. And however you turn it, you'll get another reading and another meaning. And it depends on you to figure out, well, what's the most meaningful to you? But for me, I think it's the clearest explanation of interpretation that I've ever seen. And I conned Jerry into making these. So and I don't know what happened to those. I think those are still at the Spertus. Then we got hired actually by the Chicago Architecture Foundation to do an exhibit on commercial architecture and photography that was at the Smithsonian. And a part of that exhibit was at O'Hare for the longest time. I don't know if it's still there or not. Did a lot of work for Shed Aquarium. And this is Arctic ice. And we did, I mean, I must have done 20 exhibits for the Shed, but, I thought that was a good example. Then we got hired by when I say hired, all of this means writing a proposal. And there's a huge amount of energy that goes into all of this. And of course, we didn't get all the jobs. We had a pretty good track record, but we were a small company. At our peak, we had 8 people. We mostly were in the 4 or 5 person range. The really successful firms have 100 people. And we came up against them frequently, and we often won. But it was not so easy. This was for the Detroit History Museum, where General Motors had donated 100 feet of a defunct assembly line and 3 Cadillacs in various stages of assembly. And so we worked with a structural engineering firm in order to build this catwalk so that you could see things from above, and then to actually work to install this. And it had a working body drop where you would have the chassis of the car and the body would come down on it. And we did a lot of interviews. And so the theme was how Detroit builds cars, but how cars built Detroit. And it was the first time that there was the unions and the and the manufacturers all worked hand in hand in order to make this come about. Let's see, I had a couple of stories, but I think I'm going to hold off on those for a while. Oh yeah, okay. So we got hired to do, oh, and those of you who were at the kind of little mini story that I told when we had it scheduled earlier. This was the Claude Pepper Museum on the campus of Florida State University in Tallahassee. So they have 1 million papers, but not that many artifacts. So it was, all right, how am I going to make papers interesting? So it turns out that Pepper was on the cover of Time magazine in 1938, and then he was then also in 1983. And so we got permission from Time magazine to use their layout, to copy the graphic design that they used for the magazine. And then we blew these pages up, and rather than show you like these original papers, which would be hard to read, we showed some of them in reproduction, and we also kind of did a summary about what it all meant. And so you wander through the pages of the magazine. We also, I also worked with the architectural historian of the Capitol. Who knew there was an architectural historian of the Capitol, but there is. And so we actually got the blueprints for what's called the well of the house, and we recreated it exactly. And we have Pepper there at the lectern, and then there's a kind of oral presentation that goes on with that. The other thing that we came up with was the political pendulum, because it does swing, from left to right. And so we set this up with an explanation of what does it mean to be a liberal, an explanation of what does it mean to be a conservative, and then the pendulum would be set once a year to show whether the nation was moving more liberal or more conservative. This didn't work the way that I hoped it would, but it started out as a great idea, and there was a press conference to explain it, like the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists that saw the minute to total nuclear destruction. It's the same kind of thing. We wanted every year to set this so that the nation could get a sense of where are we at as a nation. Okay, this is Museum of Science and Industry. I'm sure you've all seen this. So I'm teaching this giant airplane in place, and then explaining its role in transportation. So I have I guess it's an embarrassing story, but it's kind of funny. So we would have meetings, and we'd start out, talking about what's going on. And so there had been this unfortunate accident, and the cargo hold in one of their airplanes had lost pressure. And as a result, the animals, the pets that were in that part of the airplane froze to death. I don't know what macabre sense of humor prompted this, but I started the meeting by saying, well, I guess we're not going to do the interactive popsicle exhibit. I'm hearing the silent groans. For some reason, shortly thereafter, we were not continued on the job. I don't exactly know why. Okay, another thing. So we got hired by the Salon Museum of African American History. That.
And I have a question.
Yes.
In your previous slide, if you go back to it.
Yeah.
Why is Ptolemy up there with Roebling? I mean, Roebling's an engineer. I just looked him up because I don't know any of these people. So why is Ptolemy up there? And
Michelangelo as well. I think it's all the great, mostly men, if not entirely. I really don't know. I mean, I don't know whether that hall was always the transportation hall or the engineering hall. It has a bunch of airplanes. I have no idea.
Oh, I thought it was part of your exhibition display. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, not at all. That was just in the existing room.
I see.
Yeah, I do have to say that Museum of Science and Industry was the absolute worst client I ever had in my 25 years of doing exhibits. Their head of the exhibitions department would literally start every single meeting by saying, Oh God, I hate this place. I'm counting the days to my retirement. This is a great way to start a meeting. Every single time, it was incredibly depressing. And then the way that this whole process works is you have different phases of the project. You know, you have a research phase and a design phase, and then a detailed drawing phase and a construction phase, and so we never make any money in that first phase because we spend much more time than we think in doing the research because it takes time to do it right. So, and we had a reputation for being, academically really solid in what we did. So, so MSI, after we do that first thing, they fired us from doing the next phase for no reason. And so, and then I talked to one of my builders, and he laughed and he says, "Oh, that's the first time you've heard of that technique? They've been doing that for years. They try to get the ideas, and then they put it together themselves, and then they pay someone else to do it, and then, which is not right." And so we sued them, and we basically won. And part of the deal was that MSI said, "Well, you have to agree not to badmouth us." And I said, "I'm sorry, there's no way I'm not going to do that." Yeah. So anyway, that's MSI. Sorry if some of you love the place. It's still cool, but it was a terrible place to work. Okay, so this was through Nike and the DeSable Museum, and it was on the history of street basketball and
Alan, you froze. Can you hear?
Can someone be in touch with Alan?
I sent him a chat. I just sent him a chat and said he was froze.
Yeah, he can probably see that.
Yeah.
I repeat, Mercury is retrograde.
Yeah,
Just-
this has been a star-crossed event.
That's right. It just went retrograde, I think, on the 23rd.
By the way, there's an explanation on
Wait,
the
look there.
internet about this retrograde thing.
Yeah.
Mercury doesn't change directions. It's
No,
just
no. It appears to.
Yeah.
It appears to.
And the
Everybody, we all know that, Jack.
Oh, really? I don't know what we all know.
Thank you, Penelope.
We all know doesn't really mean everyone knows. Okay.
I didn't know that because I don't follow.
Ah,
So
Oh, do you know about Mercury retrograde?
that was that. Yeah, Mercury retrograde. There you go. Oops. Let me
I
get,
didn't, I never thought about it.
there we go.
I'm muting again.
Okay.
Back. Sorry about that.
Oh, gotcha. Good.
It just, all right, so you've been able to hear everything and things are cool? Okay. You have any questions before I try to get to the next part? No? Yes? No? Nobody? I'll just keep talking? Nod your head if you agree. Okay. Okay. All right. So now let's see if I can still do this.
Alan.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yes.
The installation at Herbert Hoover,
Yes.
was that big renovation they did in the early 1990s?
Yes.
I think I saw that.
Oh, really?
I
Wow.
did. Is
Wow.
that was in West Branch,
In West Branch, Iowa. Yes.
the presidential library?
Yes. I
Yes,
did all,
I
all
was,
the permanent.
I was helping ACT develop a placement test, and we were taking a load of data over for their research center at the university. And we decided to stop off and see the
Ah.
presidential library. And it was quite something. And I have to say, I don't want to get off track, but I did not have a favorable impression of the man before I went into the library. When I left, we spent about 3 hours there.
Wow.
When I left, it was quite extensive. There's a lot going on there. I think it's a very well laid out library. And when I left, I actually was able to identify feelings of compassion, empathy, and understanding. And I said, this is a case of not a person not being all of one thing. He was not this, conservative, incompetent, political asshole. He
Right.
really did have a heart. He really did try. And there was a much more three-dimensionality.
Oh, great.
I just wanted to pass that on to you because
Oh, that's great. That makes me feel great. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
my work.
it was really, it worked. And I remember, this is incredible.
Wow.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Well, remember the TV show of All in the Family with Archie Bunker?
Of course.
Those of you remember that, right? So the theme song for that, in the very beginning, one of the lines, which I always laughed at until I did this project, was, "Honey, we could use a man like Herbert Hoover again." And now I understand why. And
Yes.
my parents were leftists, and they said, "Oh, Hoover was great. He really did amazing things, and he was called a great humanitarian, and he got a bum rap, from history." There's a wonderful book called Herbert Hoover, Forgotten Progressive. I mean, he was an honorable guy, and that's kind of in short, a shift right now. He does not. Is not the norm. No, I mean, for me to actually like Herbert Hoover was like, what are you kidding? How is that possible? But it is. All right, I'm going to try doing the screen again and continue. I wish I could keep all you guys on the screen though, so I can see things. But all right. Oh wait, I have to hit share again. No. All right, you can see it, right? Okay. So hold on. Oh, come on. Oh, resume slideshow. Okay. All right. Why don't you try to keep your or some of you at least keep unmuted so I know that I'm not just talking into the dark here. All right. We're all okay here?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. All right. So it turns out that Chicago has this amazing history of street basketball. There's a thing called a Pro-Am, which I had never heard of, which has been going on in Chicago for like 50 years. And it's never advertised, and it's all by word of mouth. It's somewhere down on the South Side, and where pro players play against Chicago amateurs, but top-notch Chicago amateurs, many of whom ended up playing for the Bulls, actually. And so we went to those games. It was great. I'm not a sports guy, but I really got into this because I always do whatever it is I'm doing research on. And I just learned all sorts of amazing things. So what we did in this case was, this is Tim Hardaway, who used to play for the Miami Heat. And he developed a move called a crossover, where he would kind of dance around, and it was a very effective move. So we actually greased his shoes, laid out butcher paper, had him do the move. Then we constructed this thing. You push a button. We had a video of him doing the move. You push a button, and then you try to follow because the footsteps would light up. Now, of course, he's a big, tall guy, so kids would not exactly be able to do this, but they love trying. And it was just very cool. I mean, it really, really got people to see the brilliance of the players. And then we spent a lot of time in that exhibit talking about the role that sports, basketball in particular, plays in the Black community, and has played for a long time. We even set up a mock L station to kind of symbolically show that basketball was the transport out of the worlds that some of them had been living in. It was really a very, very effective exhibit. It like doubled the visitorship at the museum. It was great. And Nike, to its credit, all we had, they exercised no control whatsoever. We were afraid that they would, since they paid for the whole thing. And all that they had was the Nike swoosh before you walked into the exhibit. That was it. That was the only mention. So it really was quite good. Some of this exhibit was then brought over to Navy Pier. Some of it was set up at the NCAA, national conference. But another part of the story turns out that Chicago, of all the major cities that have sports teams, big sports teams, more people retire to Chicago than anywhere else. So we have a huge abundance of athletes who are retired from the major teams. And the other thing I didn't know is that, we think that all these sports figures make, multi-millions of dollars, and it's kind of disgusting. Well, it turns out that the top few do, but the others don't. And the others last a few years, and then that's it. That's the high point of their lives. And they go on to be, car salesmen or things like that. And they often are not doing well at all. And especially in football, I did another project with the Bears. Again, for someone who's not interested in sports, it's pretty funny. A tremendous number of those guys have, head injuries from concussions. And, their lives were great for a few years, and that was it. But in this case, it turns out that there's a bar on the west side of Chicago called the President's Lounge, and where all these old guys get together to talk about their glory days. So we did a film, the President's Lounge. We had a film company. We did a whole thing. We did these interviews in the bar. It was really interesting, really exciting. What it was like to be a black guy in those days trying to break into the field, and what it was like playing, the feelings. I mean, it was a wonderful interview. And we're ready to actually put it together as a film. And the last time that we were there, and there was some seedy goings on, I have to say. I mean, even when I was working on the exhibit, at one point, we had a couple of guys helping us, from the South Side, who were part of the street basketball scene. And we gave them an office, and they were working, in the office, calling people and doing things. One point, my partner Clifford, who was a very nervous guy, he came in, he said, Alan, I said, I think they're dealing drugs out of the back office. I went, really? He said, yeah, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? I said, I'll go talk to him. And I walked in, and indeed, that's what they were doing. They said, you can't really do that. And they went, okay, and then they left, and they didn't do that anymore. But yeah, so in this case, the film is finished, and the owner of the bar turns to me and says, well, let me just say that if you finish this film, I'm going to kill you. Film never got finished. I have no idea what happened to the footage. It's, on my list of things to try to track down. I have the name of the firm that did the work. I don't know what happened to the footage. By now, it would be great to air that material.
What do you think?
I'm sorry, what?
What do you think happened?
Boy, I can't hear you, Jerry.
I said, what do you think happened?
What do I sense happened?
Yeah, she said, what do you think happened?
To who?
To the film.
Oh, to the film. I'm sure it got lost somewhere, that it went in storage in one of these, firms. And, a lot of small video companies go out of business. And I don't know, it could be in somebody's basement somewhere. I really would like to find it, because it really, there was a lot of insight and a lot of ideas, a lot of stories that would be great, now. And this was a long time ago, so I don't think we'd be taking a risk. The next project is for the Lake County Discovery Museum. And that museum, it's still in Wakanda, Illinois. And but it was out in the country in the forest preserves. And it was really a beautiful, beautiful exhibit. They tore it down and now shifted everything to downtown Wakanda. They kept a couple of pieces from the original exhibit, but not that many. One of the things that made the Lake County Museum famous was that it acquired the Kurt Tyke postcard archives. And Kurt Tyke had an office here in Chicago, a factory in Chicago. They started before the turn of the century, and they would send photographers with their view cameras all over the world in order to take photographs of fountains in Italy, or mountains in South America, or, shacks in Tahiti, all over the world. They also did things in every small town in America, so that you would have the town square, would have a barber shop. And then if the barber shop was interested or the cafe was interested, they would photograph the cafe, make postcards, which they would then, sell to the cafe guy. But in order to, this is before color photography, so in order to make sure the colors were accurate, this was all done with lithography. We had to select the colors. They would provide like samples of the floor tile or samples of the linoleum or of the seating, cover, so that they could really match the plastics. It's an amazing archive. And you have heard of it because my friend Catherine Hamilton Smith was the curator of that collection. And she spoke at the Salon about a year and a half ago or more. So she's, because it turns out that the Lake County Museum had the largest collection of postcards, 4.5 million postcards. And when the county decided to close that facility, Catherine successfully maneuvered to have the entire collection go to the Newberry. And that's where it is. So it's safe and secure and great. But let me just go back to this for a minute. So again, I like the crawl sign thing. So things would come across and you could push a button to stop it and it would pop up. These are kind of enlarged rear transparency, so you can see what the postcards look like. There was also a research center, so you could do some, searching on a town. You might want to see whether or not they had holdings relating to that. But this was great. This was like the, postcard heaven. You were surrounded on both sides with this. It was really something. We also did, it turns out that, again, in Lake County, they had some of the earliest amusement parks in the country. And so we set up roller coaster seats and actually had fans set up that you really couldn't see, that as you watch the film about going down the roller coaster, it would blow the air into your face and the seats would rumble. It was really very cool. And then it talked about all of the different kinds of entertainment venues culminating in Six Flags. Then we got hired by the Chicago Park District to work on the children's garden at the Garfield Park Conservatory. This was great. I had my kids test this out. So this is a giant vine and you get to slide down the giant vine. We had a thing where you throw sunballs at plants and watch them grow. I had a bee on a chain that you would move, and it was like a giant bee, and it would move across the sky to a giant flower and would pollinate the flower. It was really a very, very cool place. And they've actually closed this. It's lasted this long, and they're now closing it and renovating it. And I read in the article about they're closing it. It said, we're closing our beloved children's garden. It's like, okay, you liked it. It was good. I had a seed, constructed a giant seed that you could climb over. And if you looked inside, you saw a sleeping baby plant, which is what a seed is. Then we get hired to do what for me became the first of like 4 Lincoln exhibits. This was in the courthouse in Metamora. When Lincoln was a circuit riding lawyer, he would make the circuit of all these small courthouses, and Metamora was one of them. And it was a kind of underused site. It had pretty dated exhibits. And so we redid the exhibits, and they focused on Lincoln's time in Metamora and with some specific sections on his sense of humor. And there are some very famous stories that took place in there. One of them was how this woman had been arrested for murdering her husband. Her husband was a drunk and incredibly abusive, and who used to beat her. We're talking here in the 1850s. And so everyone hated this old guy, but they didn't quite know what to do because she actually did kill him. So they had the trial. Lincoln was representing her. And at one point, there was a short recess. And when they came back, she was gone. And the judge says, where's the defendant? And he said, well, she asked me where she could get a drink of water. And I told her that I hear that water is pretty good in Tennessee. And she evidently jumped out the window and ran away. And everyone just said, court adjourned. That's like the other thing that happened there was I'm writing on this desk, and this was before the standards in these places for staffing are as professional as they are now. So this was a woman who had the job because her mother had the job. So then she got the job. And so I'm writing at this desk, and then she casually says, oh, that was Lincoln's desk. And like, what do you mean that was Lincoln's desk? Well, that's where he wrote all this. Take a look at the bottom. You see he cut out the bottom part of the desk to make room for his legs, for his long legs. So yeah, so I'm like, I'm a believer that artifacts hold residues, that there's something almost holy about artifacts. And I was like, I never touched the desk again, but it was pretty interesting. This is an exhibit that we did for the new for the Lincoln Bicentennial. Then we did some work for the Northern Indiana Center for History. And again, jump in if you guys have questions about any of this stuff while I take a sip of water. So in this case, and again, most people think that museums know what they want and they get the exhibit done. No, in most cases, museums have a vague idea of what they want, but they rely on outside firms in order to really develop that. Unless they're a major museum, and even in that case, they really ask people from the outside to weigh in on really how the stories should be told and what the stories should be. Like, for example, for Hoover, they had no clue at all, like nothing. Wisconsin, same thing. So, you have to develop things. In this place, they had no idea. Their original idea was, little velvet rope, vignettes. I said, you're not doing that. You can't do that. That's just not what's done anymore. And so I did a lot of research and, came back with a plan. And they said, well, where's farming, in here? And I said, well, to tell you the truth, the farming story in Northern Indiana is no different than the farming story in any of the other places in the Midwest. And, I'm from New York, I don't know about this. What, is there something important about something specific about the farming story here? He said, well, we don't know, but you find out. I said, okay. So went back, did some research, and came back and he said, hey, you didn't tell me that the reason your farmland is so good is because from the 1830s until almost the end of the century, you drained over 1 million acres of the greatest wetland in America, the Great Kankakee Marsh. And they said, oh, oh, I thought you knew about that. I said, how would I possibly know about that? And so what we did was we actually sent somebody out to record the sound. There's a small marsh remaining to record the sound from the marsh. We got historical photographs of what the dredge boats looked like, and we built the dredge boat, where it moves a little bit, you can walk on it. And inside there are oral histories, one from somebody extolling the incredible beauty and amazingness of this place that now no longer exists, and another from a farmer who said, well, and the truth is that royalty would come from Europe to go on hunting excursions in the Great Kankakee Marsh. And there were reports about boats being so heavily laden with fish that they started to sink. There was a phenomenal abundance of wildlife in that area, everything. But so this one farmer was saying, well, that's true. And he said, but because you drained this area, it created farmland that could support my family. And so we had, again, this is the whole idea that I wanted visitors to see that nothing's simple and that you have to look at all sides of the story. So that's the dredge boat. I also came up, you can see how old this was because that's the computer screen, which of course now would be a flat screen. And this was before the internet. So it really was a very different time. and I developed a thing called the agronomy game, where, and again, this all comes from reading, where you start to realize the kind of forces that a farmer has to contend with. And some things are in his or her control, and others are not. They're entirely random, or they're government. So I set up a thing where there's a direct connection to the U.S. Weather Service. Now that's a piece of cake. You have it on your phone. But back then, nobody did that. I mean, they had their thing, and that was that. So we had a direct link to see what the weather was like. I had these fate spinners where you spin, like this one on harvest, on land development, on what else? I think that we have on politics, and a few other things. And so you would spin this to get a question, and then if you answer the question properly, you could move your icon here. You could be a piece of corn, I think a chicken. I forget all the pieces, but you could move around the board. Also, I had quiz questions. Had you been reading my label? And I should say my responsibilities in all these projects was come up with a concept, do the research, the writing, the media, all the label copy. And then I had another partner who was an interior designer. He worked on that. And another partner who was an industrial designer. And he's the one who would set up the structures. And it was a terrific system, because I would come up with an idea, and my partner Frank would say, "That's a brilliant idea, but you can't build that," Or Clifford would come up with something, and we would say, "That's beautiful, Clifford, but it doesn't mean anything," So we all would. It was in that creative tension between the three of us that I think we developed some pretty interesting exhibits. Another thing was, I looked at Indiana on the map, and I figured, well, this has to be on the path of the Underground Railroad. And everybody there said, no, it bypassed here. It was never part of this. And I said, I don't see how that's possible. And so I went back. The National Archives has a branch in, like on Pulaski and 110th Street or something. And so I went down there. This is the National Archives had decentralized a lot of its records. So I went down there, and I uncovered information about the Underground Railroad in South Bend, including letters from, fugitive slaves, all sorts of amazing material, which I brought back and was able to convince everybody that no, this is an important part of the story. And so we recreated this, and there's a sound and light show that comes as part of that. Somebody's checking. Hold on one minute. No, I can't go with the check. Oh well. So that's that. Then we did smaller things, like this is a high school that had a new science wing, and as part of their grant to fund the science wing, they had to do some kind of an exhibit. So we came up with the idea of doing a giant, Earthrise, and then specific things attached to that. Well, the file for that didn't exist. No picture of Earthrise, the famous, blue diamond, from outer space. There was nothing big enough to span, I think this was about 80 feet long. And so I have a friend who was the head astronomer at Adler. But one of the advantages of getting older is that sooner or later you know everybody. So Geza made the Earth for me. He took satellite data and he stitched together this, I think it was like a 10 terabyte file, in order to print this incredibly beautiful thing that is in high school still. And it's a whole thing of the kind of energy things that were done at the high school. I ended up doing a total of 4 exhibits on Adlai Stevenson. And I really fell in love with this guy. I actually cut high school with my friend Spiegelman in Queens, to go down to the UN to hear Stevenson speak. This was not his famous speech, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, but it was a speech. I mean, in those days, you could just show up. You could go, and it was free, and you can sit in the balcony to watch the whole proceedings. It was great. my favorite story of my favorite story of Stevenson is that during the 1952 campaign, he was speaking from the back of a railroad car. You know, some of those famous photos with the flags and the presidential speakers. And so he's giving a speech, and then some woman shouts out from the crowd. And she says, Mr. Spiegelman, Mr. Stevenson, Mr. Steven Spiegelman will be thrilled that I have conflated him with Adlai Stevenson. She says, Mr. Stevenson, you have the support of every thinking American. And he shot back, yes, madam, but I need the majority. I know, it's really great. This exhibit is still up. It is on the grounds.
Alan, I just want to say, even though I'm on mute most of the time, my guffaws are making me so happy.
Oh, good. You can unmute because it's very unnerving because I'm actually staring because of the way that my computer is set up to do a slideshow. For some reason, I just have a blank screen. So I'm literally staring at a little white arrow on a completely blank screen and no idea whether my words are falling on deaf ears or what. You know, it's like when you're on a phone call and you're talking, and then you realize that it got cut off 20 minutes before or whatever. Anyway, so I just love Stevenson. And so this is at his former estate in Mattawa, which is, you know, just north of the city. It's outside of, where's it outside of? No, it'll come to me. But anyway, Libertyville, it's outside of Libertyville. And there was a film, The Man from Libertyville, that was broadcast during the, you know, the election. So this is we did some work in the house itself. And then also this was in the stables, which we converted into an exhibit space. And it's filled with his sayings. You know, in America, anybody can be president. That's one of the risks you take. I mean, it's just amazing, you know. It's just really wonderful. I can go through a ton of them, but let's see if I can read any of these at all. Yeah, for my part, I believe in the forgiveness and the redemption of ignorance. I mean, they're great. All of these are great. So this is a wonderful exhibit. It's still up. It's in a, you know, in this, it had been the stables, and it is closed during the winter. I always thought it would be great to get a group together and do a field trip up there. It's a wonderful exhibit, if I say so myself. And we did extensive use of graphics. I'm also very proud of the picture on the bottom there of that Senator Stevenson, Adlai III. That is probably the only known portrait of him smiling. And I took that.
Oh,
It's pretty funny. Anyway, it's really, yeah, Adlai, you know, so I have a bad case of hereditary politics. I mean, it's just great because Stevenson's grandfather, great-grandfather, convinced Lincoln to run for the presidency. And Stevenson's father was the Secretary of State. And then Stevenson III was the senator from Illinois that I worked with. And he passed about 2 years ago. You know, this is the famous quote by Walter Lippmann. You know, will we see his like again, or was he the last of his noble breed? On this question hangs the American future. I can only imagine what Adlai would think of today's politics. I mean, he would just be so appalled, so absolutely appalled. I came across a letter that Eisenhower wrote to Stevenson that said, had I known you were running, I would not have run. I mean, there was this respect, which doesn't happen anymore. Oh, yeah. So I came across this photograph of Lauren Bacall, and the inscription, which you can't see here, says, to Adlai, with all my love, both sacred and profane. I've just come across so many great stories. It's just amazing. This is the Vivian Maier exhibit that the Chicago Street Museum. I'm assuming you all know about Vivian Maier. She was the nanny who was this remarkable street photographer, and she would just stash things up, you know, she was, you know, provided housing by the families that she was the nanny for, and then eventually, and she definitely was someone with problems, and she eventually had all of her stuff in a storage locker, and then she couldn't afford the payments on it anymore. And then she fell and she was in the hospital, and someone ended up buying the contents of the storage locker, discovering her work, and then it became this big cause célèbre, but she had died at that point. And it was shown all over the place and very interesting, a lot of writing about it. I agree with some and not with others. And I see her work as like a folk artist. You know, it's not, it does not stand with like the great, you know, photographers of all time, but the images are compelling and wonderful, and the story is astonishing. And anyway, so what we did here was blew up these photos, and I worked with a printer who was able to replicate the tone of the paper that was available in the 1960s and 70s when she was, mostly 60s, when she was doing this work. And that may not mean anything to the rest of you, but to a photographer, you could come in there and go, oh my God, that's a cotobromide tone. I mean, it's really, it was very, very special to have that. And then what I did was suspended the photos so that there's space in between. And the whole idea is that, and you can watch the visitors doing this, they come in and they start looking between those spaces. And that's exactly the experience of a street photographer. You are always jockeying for position, always looking, trying to figure out what's going on. So I've managed to actually replicate the experience that she would have had in taking the photos. I'm really very proud of that because it really works. And then I took 18 rolls of her film and set it up like wainscoting in the exhibit gallery so that you can see in a roll of film what she was thinking. I mean, today, you know, since there are no more rolls of film or nobody uses film anymore, you know, it's a totally different understanding. If you knew you had 12 shots on a roll, which is what the square format that she used for 120 film, if you knew that you only had 12 takes and it was costly to develop and print the film, you were very judicious in what you shot. You didn't just go shooting willy-nilly because you couldn't do that. And if you shot 35 millimeter, you had 36 exposures. Well, now, you know, people will shoot off 36 exposures in 2 minutes and without really stopping to compose anything or think about something or really react in a visual way. So in this, you can see exactly what she was thinking as she went from photograph to photograph. And that's Jerry, of course, and my friend Jack. And that brings us up to Following the Box, which many of you have seen, for which I am eternally grateful. This is the opening of the exhibit in Reno. The exhibit is now in storage here in Chicago while we're trying to find another venue. So if any of you have any friends, suggestions in the museum world, preferably in this country, let me know. We actually now own the exhibit, having bought all the pieces from the artist with the understanding that once the exhibit is no longer circulating, we will sell the pieces for them and, you know, give them the profits or donate it to a place that is meaningful and with their permission. And everyone agreed. And so they sold us their work at about 1/10 of what it really should be valued at, which was great. But one other thing, which I probably have never mentioned to anybody, is I was a little nuts. And in addition to doing the major exhibit in India, we got a grant from the State Department to do a graphic panel exhibit that talks about the project, but also explores research. Well, what is research? What does that mean? How do you do it? What do you have to do? What are the questions you have to ask? And then it also explored India's role in World War II, which most people know nothing about, and also what America was doing in India during World War II. Another pretty, you know, hidden part of the war was part of the CBI, the China, Burma, India theater of war. There were no boots on the ground, but there were bombing raids and there were supply missions and all sorts of things. But it doesn't have the same cachet as the fighting in the streets. So people don't know much about it. It's a really fabulous exhibit, and it was set up on these kind of stanchions It opened at the University of Chicago Center in Delhi. Then it went to the U.S. Embassy in Delhi. Then it went to the Indian Museum in Kolkata. And it was supposed to go to all of the U.S. consulates throughout India. I'm not sure that ever happened. And so far as I know, it's in storage in the basement of the embassy, in Delhi. But what I decided to do was to reprint these, make it a little bit smaller, and frame each of these pieces. And so that's something that is hopefully going to open at the consulate, the Indian consulate here in Chicago. Also, my college, Queens College and City University, they were interested in it. And then I have a slideshow that scrolls through all 127 of the pictures. So again, this is the kind of thing that can be put in any library or school, as opposed to the big show, which is about 2,000 square feet and really is a big deal. So we're hoping we can tell the story by circulating this smaller show. So again, anyone have any friends in libraries or universities, let me know and I'll send them information about it. This is just a list of the kinds of places that we did. This is some of the clients. Army Corps of Engineers, we did a thing about the dams on the Middle Mississippi River. We did a corporate history of Arthur Anderson. Biltmore in Asheville, we did about 3 exhibits for them. I mean, I think you can read the list unless, is the type too small to read the list?
No,
No, so you can all read it? Okay. So it's all of these places. And many times.
I can't read it, but that's my eye problem.
I'll just read it quickly so it's easy. The Army Corps of Engineers, Arthur Anderson, Biltmore Company, Brinks, the Brookfield Zoo, Canal Corridor Association, Caterpillar Corporation, Chicago Academy of Sciences. Oh, I have a funny story about that too. Chicago Architecture Foundation, Chicago Department of Environment, Chicago History Museum, Chicago Park District, the Tribune, the Floyd Pepper Center, Crow Canyon Archaeology Center in Colorado, the Detroit History Museum, the DuSable Museum, the Exelon Pavilion in Millennium Park, Facing History in Ourselves, the Field Museum, the Florida Department of State, the Hoover Library, Holiday Park Nature Center in Indianapolis, Illinois Historic Preservation Agency, the Juvenile Justice Department here in Chicago, the Illinois State Museum, the Shedd Aquarium, Lake County Forest Preserve, the Lincoln Park Zoo, the Mark Twain Museum, Mexican Museum, the Clean County Museum of History, Missouri Historical Society, Motorola, MSI, Newberry, Northern Indiana, Donnelly, the Spertus Museum, Wisconsin, and Zimmer Corporation. It's not too bad for not too bad. So why don't we end this slideshow so then I can stop sharing? I will do that. Hold on 1 second. Stop sharing. How do I stop sharing? Okay, there we go. All right. So thank you.
Thank you, Alan. I've got to sign off. It was just a treat to follow your career through all these exhibits, some of which I've saw, particularly following the box, but wow, something to truly be proud of. Thank you for sharing it with us.
Well, thanks. And thanks for the opportunity to put it together, because it's like, you just do things. And then I'm looking at this and going, well, that's not too shabby. That looks pretty good.
You don't have Ralph Edwards to do This Is Your Life, but here it is.
Right.
I've got to sign off, everybody.
Okay.
Bye.
Right,
Thanks
bye.
again. Bye.
Alan,
Yeah.
thank you so much for sharing this. I'm really, really impressed, and not just